I want to come back this evening to the subject of the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Praise God.
which is what Albright said is the most fantastic, the greatest in modern times manuscript discovery. And we said probably the greatest manuscript discovery of all time up until now is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Maybe someone in the church will end up being an archaeologist and will go over there and make a better discovery.
Hallelujah.
I don't know if that'd be the best thing or not. By the way, if you hadn't heard the latest about Noah's Ark that came out a little while ago about someone discovered it, that was just the press that reported that. I read the article by the people who were over there doing the alleged discovery, and they never said a word about discovering the Ark. All they found was a big depression in the ground. They think it's Noah's Ark underneath that, but they never said they discovered the Ark. That was just the press, evangelical, hyped-up press, you know, that got a hold of that and really thought they'd do the commies in by saying they'd found the Ark. And those people said, to set the record straight, they never found the Ark. But they're going to go back and try to dig up. It's something that fits the size that's set forth over there in the Genesis account of Noah building his Ark, chapter 6, so they'll have to wait and see, and so will we. Anyway, I guess that came to mind in light of discoveries in archaeology. Okay, last week we ended up talking about the 11 caves that were discovered over an 11-year period from 1956, or from 1946 to 1956. We gave you a little of the history of the background of the initial discovery. Remember, there were 3 scrolls discovered by the Ta'amira Bedouin tribe that were sold to Professor Sukenik at the Hebrew University, who was the father of Yigal Yadin, who made some other famous discoveries and purchases. And then later there were 4 other, that was in the end of 46, and the beginning of 47. There were 4 other scrolls that turned up by the same Bedouin group. He had gone back over to the same cave. They hadn't taken everything. They were out herding their goats that day, and they only took 3. And so they came back in either the late part of the winter or the early part of the spring of 47, got 4 more manuscripts, and they sold them to Metropolitan Samuel of St. Mark's Orthodox Syrian Monastery in Jerusalem. And so that's what really set the scene for the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then there are a lot of things that took place afterwards. I found another picture that maybe all of you can see a little better of this desolate place. Let me get myself oriented of what direction's going on. This is that desolate climate. Again, you're going to see the little Essene community, and then down here will be where the caves are. But it's in color. At least, I know most of the people here can't see it, but at least those up at the front. Which is why you ought to sit up at the front, especially when it's show and tell time. You ought to sit up on the front row. Somebody's got seats reserved up here. I think I always see the same people up here. But show and tell night, you'll be able to see what I'm showing you. So that's where it was discovered. And you see, that's how unlikely it is. Unless you think that, you know, there was a big painted sign over the top that says, look in here, you'll find Dead Sea Scrolls. Nothing like that happened. And besides that, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of caves that identical to this, all in that area. So it's just a matter of hap. H-A-P, as I think Ruth chapter 2 says, just a matter of hap that someone happened to come upon these caves and take it upon themselves to go inside and look around. There weren't any stars of Bethlehem over the top guiding the wise Bedouin travelers to search that. It's just providence, we should say, that they happened upon the caves and found it. But there are lots of caves around there, so it's not like you can sit out there and think, well, I could have done that. Anybody could have found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why didn't they for 2,000 years then, if anybody could? They've been lost for 2,000 years, and I'm sure other people have passed those little caves, but nobody's going to crawl up there and go in that. It can be pretty dangerous going up the side of a cliff like that. So what we want to look at tonight are the contents of the caves, the series of 11 caves. Because unless you break it down and look at this, then people just think of one initial Dead Sea Scroll discovery, where someone discovered all the Dead Sea Scrolls. And just by giving you the history of the dates of when the caves were discovered last week shows you that's certainly not true. So we want to look at the caves 1 through 11. Caves 1, 4, and 11 are definitely the three most important ones. How can I rank them? I guess number 1 would be the most important. I guess it's a matter of choice, but I think that 1 would be the most important, 4 would be behind that, 11 behind that, and then I don't know, I hadn't figured out the rest of them, but then you put the rest of them in order. 2 and 3 are fairly important. I don't think the others are important as those. So 1, 4, and 11 would be the ones to concentrate on. So let's start with the first cave then. It was first discovered by the Bedouins, so you can list them just cave 1. This is how we'll go. And we just gave you a brief sketch last time about when these caves were discovered. So cave 1 was discovered by the Bedouins probably toward the end of 1946. Remember, we gave you 3 dates, either 45, 46, or 47. Practically no one holds to the 45 date. Practically everyone holds to the 47th date. And perhaps 46 should be the right date, so that's the one we're going to stay with. It seems like, the reason we picked that, by the way, it seems like the Bedouins were pretty sly Arabs, like a lot of Arabs are, and they're not going to tell us exactly when they found it and tell us all the details. They tell a lot of lies, and they talk around in circles about this and that, and so you never really know what's going on. But they probably didn't discover it back in the 1700s and been holding it for that long or something. It's got to be somewhere in this time period. And they went back in the early spring, evidently, of 1947. So this is a cave that we talked about last week. We didn't name it as the first cave. And searched it again and found 4 more scrolls. So from cave 1 comes the 7 more or less complete scrolls. The 3 that we talked about that were sold to Sukenik, I'll give you which ones were sold to him, and the 4 that were sold to Metropolitan Samuel. So 7 manuscripts we want to mention under cave 1. Now from Sunday school class in Dead Sea Scrolls, what's the most important of all of the discoveries in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Okay, everybody knew that. You must have been to Sunday school then. You learned it here. Well, we better not call this Sunday school. Maybe back in one of the early teachings or something. Okay, anyway, we'll start with what we call, I'll give you several names of it. Like we did with the manuscripts, there's an official name and then there's a technical designation. You certainly don't have to remember the designations on this because the names are sufficient. It's referred to as either the Great Isaiah Scroll. There's a great one, which means there's one not so great. So they distinguish the two by calling this one the Great Isaiah Scroll. A lot of times you'll see it called St. Mark's Monastery Isaiah Scroll. So this ended up in the hands of Metropolitan Samuel. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as Isaiah A, just a capital A. And then here's the technical designation. Most of them don't even have, well, they have a technical designation, but no one uses it. But they use this one quite frequently, so you might want to remember it. It goes like this: a 1, then a capital Q, capital I, small s, superscript A. 1 stands for the first cave. Q stands for Qumran instead of Murababit or one of the other areas. IS, abbreviation for Isaiah, and A, first letter of the alphabet to refer to it as the first of the Isaiah scrolls, or the fragments of Isaiah. Like many different parts of Isaiah, a verse here, a paragraph there, a chapter here that had been torn out of a manuscript was found also in a lot of the caves. We're talking about a fairly complete, well in this case, a totally complete scroll. So, Great Isaiah Scroll, St. Mark's Monastery Isaiah Scroll, Isaiah A, or generally 1QISA, which stands, as I said, for First Cave, Qumran Community or Area. What book is it about? Isaiah. And which one of the Isaiah fragments or scrolls? The first one, A. This is by far the most famous, the most important of the scrolls. It's a complete copy on leather of the entire book of Isaiah, from chapter 1 to chapter 66. It's made up of 17 sheets of leather that are carefully, very carefully, sewn together. And all in all, it equals a length of around 24 feet. Now, remember some of the figures of length we've given you in the past, like the Egyptian manuscripts that are like 130 feet long. So it's not that you could call this one small, because 130 feet is just extraordinary. You don't find a lot of them like that. But it's a good-sized manuscript, because you could have a little book like Joel, and you're not going to have it 24 feet long. You'll probably have it all on 1 or 2 sheets there. Here's a picture of it, a good color picture of it. You can see closely enough. You can see the divisions between the sheets. It's opened up. I don't know what it's open to. Open to Isaiah 38, verse 8 through chapter 40 and verse 28. You can see even the animal fiber thread has been used to hold it together. It's a very beautiful picture. The standard picture of the great Isaiah scroll. Because you'll see this in a lot of books. It's the same thing. The book is heavy. I'll have to change hands. I'll come back for the camera in just a minute for people in the other room. Where is it today? I'm not for sure that this one's there, but the vast majority of these are now either in the Jordanian Archaeological Museum or a museum in Israel known as the Shrine of the Scrolls. It's in one of those 2 museums. Someone thinks it's in the latter one. I'm not for sure, but it's in one of those 2 museums. Now, I just said, because it gives you in the caption here, the portion of Isaiah it's turned to 38 to 40, and of course, I think we mentioned this in Old Testament. But one of the most interesting things in this regard is that there's no division between chapter 39 and chapter 40 in Isaiah. Remember the theories that were trying to disprove Isaianic unity, starting with Doderlin back in the 1700s, and then George Adam Smith, I believe in around 1889, invented his Deutero-Isaiah theory, that there were 2 Isaiahs. And then another fellow comes along the scene, I think Bernhard Doom in 1892, and invents a 3rd Isaiah. Well, there's a good place to put a division. If there are 2 different authors writing this, there's no division. It all just runs right together at the end of chapter 39 and the beginning of chapter 40, which is very interesting. Let's see, I've got some other pictures of different things regarding it and regarding just the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you don't have a copy of Ernst Werthwain's The Text of the Old Testament, it'd be good to get a copy. He's got almost 50 pictures or plates is what they call them in books like this, 50 plates in the back of all different types of manuscripts. A lot of the ones that we're going to be talking about are found here, and we've brought some of these pictures before. There's a close-up of the cave, the Bedouin sitting beside the opening. The only way you can get in this cave is you have to crawl in it. Just a tiny, tiny cave that you crawl in. The Text of the Old Testament by Ernst Werthwain, a German author. W-U-R-T-H-W-E-I-N. There's a picture of 2 of the jars. Remember we talked about he threw a rock in and cracked one of the jars? The picture of the jars. Here's the great Isaiah scroll. As a matter of fact, it's opened up to the same portion. That's what I said. It's just a standard picture. Here's a close-up. Chapter 40, verses 6 through 20. Here's a good close-up of the manuscript. You can see the Hebrew writing. One thing that's interesting is verse 7. Part of verse 7 is left out. Up here at the top, It's been scribbled in between the lines by another scribe who came later, and the name of God is left out, and 4 dots. You can see those 4 dots are substituted for the name of God. Yahweh is left out, and 4 dots are placed in there. And what we can say about the great Isaiah scroll is that it's the earliest known copy of a complete book of the Bible, which makes it very important by itself. It's the earliest known copy of a complete book of the Bible, of any book, Old or New Testament, the earliest known copy. It dates somewhere in the area of 100 B.C., which makes it over 2,000 years old. And again, from the big color picture, you can see the condition that it's in. It's in almost perfect condition. 2,000 years old. Okay, a second scroll, still in the first cave, is the Habakkuk commentary. A commentary on the minor prophet Habakkuk. The first 2 chapters are written in Hebrew, and then beside it, a commentary is written in Hebrew. It's totally worthless. It's just a lot of fanciful perversions of the text meaning, and it's not a sound commentary at all. But it shows the tendency toward people even of that day of wanting to make a comment on the Word. That's not a modern invention of charismatics or Baptists or something. Everybody likes to get the Word and tell us what they think that it means. And that's what they did. And here it is. It's a close-up. It's very, very good Habakkuk commentary. Here's Habakkuk here, the commentary over on this side. One thing to notice, since this is so close up, notice what's lacking from our study of last week. Points. No points at all. Remember, that's the Masoretic invention. We're way back 100 B.C. now, so you're reading nothing but consonants there. So that's one of the first 2 chapters of Habakkuk. Chapter 2, verses 7 to 14. So part of Habakkuk chapter 2. That one was one of the 4 that was sold to Metropolitan Samuel, as well as the first one. So far, these first 2 ended up in the possession of Metropolitan Samuel, and he ended up selling them to the nation of Israel. Then a third manuscript was the second, or the lesser, Isaiah scroll. This one was one of the first 3 discovered, and this one was sold to Sukenik. It's also known as 1QISB. First cave, Qumran, Isaiah, second Isaiah scroll. 1QISB. It's an incomplete copy. It's not in very good condition, because when it was wound together, some of the resin of the material, or some of the fatty, gluey substance of the material, would leak out and cause that was rolled on top to stick together. And a lot of them, it was virtually impossible to break it loose. This is part of Isaiah 48 and part of Isaiah 50. You can see it's just in fragmentary condition. Nothing like that first scroll, the great Isaiah scroll, in such perfect, picture-perfect condition. And that's why a lot of the modern scholars today think these things are forgery, especially one like great Isaiah. It's in such perfect condition. Now, what's interesting about the second Isaiah scroll is that it agrees more completely with the Masoretic text. Or we really should turn it around and say the Masoretic text agrees more completely with second Isaiah scroll than with first Isaiah scroll. We'll say some more about that later on. Okay, another very interesting manuscript in the 4th place. That one I said was sold to Sukenik. The 4th one goes to Metropolitan Samuel. It's known as the Genesis Apocryphon. It was very, very badly damaged. They tried to get it apart a piece at a time, from what I remember, because it also, like part of the second Isaiah scroll, was simply stuck together. One piece of it that they were able to get loose back at the very beginning had the name of Lamech on it. Now, do you remember where Lamech is in the Bible? It's back in the book of Genesis. And that initially is where it received its name, because they knew that it had to do something, had to do with Lamech to some degree. And I think they even called it Lamech's scroll for a while, until they were able to get more of it apart and determine what it was all about. Now here it is at the bottom of this page. The Genesis, now it's been named the Genesis Apocrypha, and just fragments of it. But at the very beginning they tore just a little slip off, and all they could read on it was the name Lamech, so they knew that it had to do somehow with the book of Genesis. What does it do? It gives us a whole bunch of fanciful legends about the patriarchs, a lot of works that they did, none of which are true, or none of which can be supported in the Word of God. And interesting enough, it's written in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. So it contains a lot of false stories about the patriarchs. What do things like that do? Well, one thing that they do is they serve to prove that the patriarchs really did exist. It wasn't an invention of the Catholics in the 7th century A.D. or something. You've got someone way back 100 B.C. referring to the patriarchs. But the false stories and the legends that it contains certainly aren't to be followed. You shouldn't put any faith or trust in them. A fifth manuscript goes by several names. It's called the Rule of the Community, and it's also known as, and probably more often known as, the Manual of Discipline. Remember, we're not talking about Orthodox Old Testament Jewish people. We're talking about a religious Jewish sect which had broken off from the orthodoxy of Judaism. And so not only do they have in their library books on the Bible, but they've got commentaries on the books from the Old Testament, as well as a lot of books that don't have anything to do with the Old Testament. And one of these is the Manual of Discipline. It contains a lot of laws and regulations governing the members of the Essene Qumran sect. Laws for entrance into their little sect, as well as for maintaining your membership. Here it is on this side of the page, the right-hand side of the page. In pretty good condition. The Rule of the Community, or the Manual of Discipline. I want to read you part of it from another book to show you what some of the requirements were. And we'll probably study the Essenes and the Qumran community more at another time, but here's from part of the rule. This is the rule for the men of the community who volunteer to turn from all evil and to hold to all that he commanded for his good pleasure, to be separated from the congregation of the men of unrighteousness, to become a community in doctrine and in property. They were a communal setup. To reply at the command of the sons of Zadok, the priest, who keep the covenant, at the command of the majority of the men of the covenant who hold to the covenant. For at their command shall proceed the lot for every matter. They decided things by casting lots. For doctrine, for property, and for judgment. To perform true unity and humility, righteousness and justice, the love of mercy and decency to the sect in all their ways, where no one shall walk in the stubbornness of his heart to go astray after his heart and his eyes and his impulsive thought. Just goes on and on. When they are gathered for community, all who come to the council of the community shall enter into the covenant of God before the eyes of all the volunteers. The postulant shall be confirmed upon his soul with the binding oath to return to the Torah of Moses, according to all that he had commanded, with all heart and with all soul, and according to all that was revealed of it to the sons of Zadok the priest, to keep the covenant and seek his good pleasure, on and on and on. Let the postulants not enter the water to touch the purity of the men of holiness, for they shall not be clean, except they have turned from their evil. For unclean are they in all their transgressions of his holy word. Even gives a quote here from Exodus 23:7. And just goes on and on. Lots and lots of rules. It's a long manuscript that gives lots of rules for the community, for your entrance into it, and maintaining your relationship to it. This one was sold to Metropolitan Samuel as well. So that takes care of the 4 to Metropolitan Samuel. Another document that's similar to it's known as the Damascus or the Zadokite document. Remember, he was just talking there in that the rule of the community about the sons of Zadok. They really did follow that line of the priesthood instead of the sons of Eli, which would have been another line. But this Damascus, it's also known as the Zadokite document, was only known to exist at one time anyway from some medieval manuscripts that were discovered in Egypt in the year 1897. There was a manuscript discovered that contained what we call the Damascus or the Zadokite document because it had to do with the sons of Zadok the priest, a group of people following them and following their laws. And so evidently, and once the discoveries at the Dead Sea area were made, then at least 9 other fragments from manuscripts turned up that were the same as this Damascus document that had been discovered in 1897 in Egypt. So we know evidently that the Damascus or the Zadokite document, although it's different from the rule of the community, it still had something to do with that group of people because they're always following the sons of Zadok. So we haven't found a complete manuscript of Damascus scroll at the Dead Sea area, but it's been found in Egypt, in Cairo, so one isn't needed. No one really knows what the word Damascus means, except maybe it has some mystical reference to the Qumran community. But they thought that they were the new Damascus, in other words, that had appeared on the scene. Okay, a 6th manuscript is known as the Thanksgiving Hymns. Where we've got about 30 devotional hymns that were used by the Qumran members, some of which resemble slightly, we should say, some of our Psalms in the Old Testament Psalter. I'll read you one of their hymns. I think this comes from the 5th hymn. Just a group of hymns that they would use in their liturgical worship, like the Jews would the book of Psalms. I thank thee, Lord, that thou didst not leave me when I dwelt with a people heavy with sin. For not according to my transgression, nor according to my guilt hast thou judged me. And thou didst not leave me in the abominations of my hearts, but thou hast saved my life from the pit. For thou didst appoint thy servant a fugitive in the midst of lions, ready for the sons of guilt, lions that break the bones of the noble and drink the blood of the strong. Thou hast put me in terror with many fishermen, who spread the net upon the face of the waters, and with hunters for the sons of evil. But it goes on to talk about deliverance. You close the mouth of the lions, whose teeth are like a sword, and their fangs like sharp spears, poison of serpents, their only thought to seize prey. But though they lie in wait, they do not open their mouth against me, for thou, Lord, hast hidden me from the presence of the sons of men. It's not really exactly like the book of Psalms. There's the whole tone and spirit of it is different, and it should be. It's not inspired scripture, so it should be different. But that shows you at least one of the Thanksgiving hymns. He's giving thanks that God delivered him from the sons of men. Then the final scroll in this first cave. So you can see how important this first cave is, because we've got all of these important scrolls turning up here, is known as the War Scroll. This one, as well as Thanksgiving hymns sold to Succoth. The War Scroll was a preparation manual for some future eschatological battle that gave tactics and weapons and even little prayers that were to be prayed as the sons of light overcame the sons of darkness. There were 2 groups of people known as the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The sons of darkness followed someone that's referred to as the evil priest. And the sons of light, do you know who they followed? If you've ever studied about Dead Sea Scrolls, it's probably the most famous individual throughout the writings that have been discovered in the Dead Sea area. Well, he's known as the teacher of righteousness. That many people want to draw parallels between him and Jesus or him and John the Baptist or something like that. There aren't any parallels, by the way. This was to be a 40-year eschatological battle, divided up in, well, to begin with, I think it was 6-year periods, where for 6 years they'd fight against Moab, and then 6 against Ammon, and 6 against this group, and they'd fight so many years. Obviously, it's not divisible by 6. There were other battles that were to be fought, and then I think they had a 5-year rest period or something at the end. So this was, kind of like, the people that are out in the caves today with their little war manuals, the survivalist group on what to do. Here were some survivalist teachings, tactics and weapons, prayers, on how to overcome the sons of darkness whenever you started this 40-year battle. Just amazing what's been found, where people got all these ideas. You see, they didn't get it from the Old Testament. Where they got it from, nobody knows. Somebody was a mystic in the group, evidently, and sat around and dreamed things up about 40-year eschatological battles. Well, this first cave was officially excavated from February the 15th through March the 9th, 1949. Now, these 7 scrolls have already turned up. That's what we're talking about in 46 and 47. They've already turned up. But it was, and that was by the discovery of the Bedouins. But it was officially excavated by the archaeologists from February 15th through March the 9th, 1949. It gave fragments of at least 10 other Old Testament books, that is 10 in addition to the ones we've mentioned, and 7 other non-biblical books, a non-biblical one being like the Manual of Discipline, or the Thanksgiving hymns, or the War Scroll. Any of those would be non-biblical. Plus commentaries on the following books or chapters. The greatest commentary of all of them is the commentary on Habakkuk, because that's a complete commentary on the first 2 chapters of Habakkuk. So the Habakkuk commentary is the one to remember by name. And it's a complete one. But the other ones are just partial. There's a partial commentary on Isaiah, one on Hosea, one on Micah, Nahum, Zephaniah, and Psalm 37. So that closes up Cave 1, which I would say is the greatest of the caves because of all we've just spent most of our time. Some of the other ones we'll breeze over and not mention a thing because not much was found there. But this is an important cave, especially with that great scroll of Isaiah that was found. But we go on to some other interesting things because of different material used and because of earlier dates involved. Cave 2 we come to next was discovered by the Bedouins after they found out what type of profit they could make from these scrolls. They gave up the goat herding business and took off as amateur archaeologists for the Dead Sea area in 1952. They didn't really get a lot out of it. They're looking for these whole manuscripts. And remember, they're not trained, they're not professionals. So they don't go through the process. You have to go and work or study it where you get it's a whole system of work. You have to have sieves with you and get the dust and sift through it and look for like diamonds. You're looking for just a little tiny fragment of a manuscript, anything you can find that'll give you some clue to who was there and what type of writing they've left behind. And they just go in there and look around. Do you see any gold, any jars? No. They go back out then. So they went in, didn't find anything. They left. It was officially excavated in March of 1952, the same year. So it was discovered early that year. And it was excavated March 10th through 29th. Fragments of at least 100 manuscripts. That's what they missed in looking in there. Fragments of 100 manuscripts were found representing the following Old Testament books, as well as some extra biblical books. Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Ruth, Job, Psalms, Jeremiah. Okay, cave 3. Now the archaeologists have got busy searching for them themselves without having to wait for the Bedouins to come and report it. So they discover the third cave in 1952, shortly after the excavation of the second cave. You have to remember the whole backdrop of all of the Arab-Israeli conflict, so it's not easy just to run in there and start looking around. There's a lot of passports and checkpoints and a lot of different officials that you have to go through before you can even get out there and start looking around. This was led by a French scholar. They were in the process of exploring about 200 caves. And of course, the vast majority of them that were discovered didn't have anything in them. It's like gambling, you know, the vast majority of the times you gamble, you don't win anything. Some occasions you do, and hopefully, at least in your mentality, that's supposed to make it all worthwhile. So they go out looking in a lot of caves, and most of them don't turn up anything but what they're supposed to have, a lot of stones and dirt and spiders. But in this one, they do find some things. They found it and searched it on March the 14th, 1952. What did it turn up? It turned up the most unusual of all of the scrolls, known as the copper scroll, which was in 2 halves. And it took the experts until 1955 even to get it open and apart in order to read it. By the way, it's really extra-biblical. It doesn't have anything to do, except with their community, with the Old Testament. I'll tell you what it does here. Here's a picture of a professor at Manchester's College of Technology in England cutting it open in 55 with a sophisticated instrument. It's made out of copper. I'll show you another color picture of it here in a moment. Very interesting. It's made out of copper, real thin copper that had been beaten out, like you can beat copper out today and make it real thin, and all rolled up real tightly. And it had just more or less oxidized itself right together where you couldn't get it apart. So there's a technician opening it up. I think this is a picture of it. It's on the same page as the Great Isaiah Scroll. Here's a picture of it down at the bottom. It might look like animal skin or papyrus, but it's not. It's made out of metal, solid metal. It's a copper scroll. What does it give in it? It gives the alleged location, 60 of them, where fabulous amounts of gold and silver are buried. So I don't guess the example of gambling was so far off after all. They thought they had really struck it rich now. John Allegro searched all 60 sites and couldn't find anything. But landmarks can change. You cannot understand what is meant in the scroll. The names of rocks and cities and little pools of water could change over the centuries. So most people believe that it's still true, that they had fabulous amounts of money stored up somewhere and no one's found these yet. Or if they have, they've not been found in connection with the descriptions of the area, the directions to these spots that are provided here in these scrolls. When you put both of them together, they're 8 feet long, so it's a little short one. 11 inches tall, 8 feet long. And like I say, people have searched and searched, and no one's found the missing treasure. The newest fad today in treasure hunting is go to the bottom of the ocean. With all of the sophisticated equipment that people have today, you'd be surprised at the number of millionaires overnight that have made their millions by searching the bottom of the oceans for sunken Spanish ships, you know, back in the 1600s that were carrying all this gold. I mean, whenever you sink in a couple of 100 feet of water, there's just no way you're going to find it without this equipment. And I mean, they've got metal detectors that go through 20 feet of solid earth and pick up a piece of metal down underneath that. And you just, you know, drag it behind a ship. You drop it down there like an eavesdropping device. And you run it across the bottom of the ocean, and people are making millions all the time. There are companies in Florida, a lot of companies in Florida, whole companies built on, we'll go find that ship. You give us directions how to get there, and we'll split the profit with you whenever we find it. And guess who gets to keep it? They do. You have to pay a certain amount of tax to the state if it's, you know, in that area. You don't have to pay the Spanish government anything. They're not over here looking for it. It's Americans looking for it. I think The latest one was discovered, I think, near Maryland, or no, Massachusetts, I believe, near Massachusetts. And they had to pay several $1 million tax to Massachusetts whenever they found it. But it's all pure gold and silver, though. It's worth a fortune, you know, $1 million. That's nothing in taxes when you've got nothing but solid, pure gold and silver. So that's where to make your millions today. Don't go looking over in the Dead Sea area. It's too hot over there to be looking around anyway. Cave number 4. By far, this was the biggest discovery in the number of manuscripts that it yielded. Not in the length or the importance of them, that's for Cave 1, but in the number of manuscripts. Evidently, the Bedouins saw it first and never really searched around, and it was excavated in September by the archaeologists in the year 1952. It gave 40,000 fragments. Compare this to Cave 2 of 100 manuscript fragments. 40,000 fragments representing at least 400 different manuscripts, and of these at least 100 were biblical. So that means, like, if you find, let's say Genesis, you find a fragment from Genesis over one part of the cave, and you find another fragment over there, that counts as 2 manuscripts. We're not talking about 2 different books as far as the content, but 2 different manuscripts. You could tell by the handwriting that's used that you've got 2 different manuscripts written at 2 different times by 2 different people. So there are a lot of ways that you could tell that. And what if you found Genesis 1:1 twice? Then you know you've got 2 manuscripts and not 1. So there are different ways you determine that 100 of these manuscripts were biblical. Every book in the Old Testament except 1 is represented. Many of them are duplicated many times over. Going back to our studies in Canonicity, which one would that be? Esther. Esther. That's why people have always had problems with Esther. That's why they were having problems with the book at that time. Book of Esther. No fragment of the book of Esther at all. So people say, see, the Jews didn't accept Esther in their canon, but we believe that they did. The most important thing about Cave 4 is that here we have our oldest biblical text that's ever been found. Found in Cave 4. Well, I can give you the technical designation, and you ought to be able to guess what book it's from real quickly. What's it gonna start off with? Someone start the designation off. 4. What's the next thing? Q. What's the next thing? S-A-M. Samuel. B. It's the 2nd Samuel manuscript here. Dated 200 B.C. Earliest biblical text extant. Earliest one that's ever been found. And here it is, just a fragment from 1 Samuel 23, verses 9 to 13. Up at the top of the page. So you're looking at something 2,200 years old. The oldest part of the Bible that's ever been found is 1 Samuel 23. Very interesting why certain things were discovered. So that's what really makes Cave 4 important, as well as the fact that 40,000 fragments were found there. Okay, Cave 5, excavated in September 1952, yielded handful of fragments, not worth very much.
For the continuation of this message, please turn the tape over.
Okay, Cave 5, excavated in September 1952, yielded handful of fragments, not worth very much. These last ones aren't nearly as important as the first ones. Cave 6, excavated around the same time. One interesting thing about Cave 6 is instead of leather, most of the pieces of manuscripts were papyrus, which are different than the leather or the sheepskin that have been found in the other cases. Two important books represented here, represented many times over, were Daniel and the Book of Kings. Remember, they didn't have 1st and 2nd Kings, so we'll just call it Kings. Cave 7, excavated in February 1955. Not of great interest. Cave 8, the same as Cave 7. Cave 9 in March of 1955. Most of these are being discovered by the archaeologists. Cave 10, April of 1955. And then the final one, Cave 11. Behind 1 and 4, it'd be the third most important of the 11 caves. Excavated in February of 1956, where 7 rather extensive manuscripts were discovered, including one of the Book of Psalms and one of the Book of Leviticus. In Hebrew, the most interesting thing about Cave 11, we give you a little footnote for the interesting thing about some of the caves anyway, was that we've got 151st Psalm, which is about what? We've told you that before. What's the 151st Psalm about? We've mentioned it, I remember several times. What?
Musical instrument.
No. Well, I thought someone remembered. It's the story of what? David and Goliath. The story of David and Goliath. It's evidently David's praise of victory over Goliath. Now what's interesting, we already had the 151st Psalm, but we had it in Greek. This is the earliest and the only known Hebrew copy, which shows that there was an original in Hebrew, which means it goes back way before the time of Christ. It's not some invention of Christians after the time of Christ. So it's the only and the first Hebrew copy of Psalm 151 that previously was known only in the Greek language. Summing all of that up, we see that thousands of manuscripts were found over this 11-year period, or fragments of them. 500 manuscripts are represented in all. Now remember, that doesn't mean 500 different titles to books, like Genesis and Exodus being 2. If you can find Genesis 1:1 4 times, then you got 4 manuscripts represented there. At one time it was evidently a complete manuscript, and now all we have is Genesis 1:1. So don't think of 500 different titles to books, but 500 completely different manuscripts written by a different scribe, a different time, or whatever, with 175 of these being biblical in content. Not only was it just true for Cave 4, it's true for all of them. All books of the Old Testament are represented many times over, except the little book of Esther. Not a fragment of Esther has been found. So it's good we've had to look at that before, so your faith isn't shaken about the book of Esther. Go back and hear the tapes that we dealt with that on, and get things straightened out in your mind if you have a problem with Esther. But Esther is important. Remember, it's the great book in the Old Testament that deals with a supernatural preservation of the whole country, the whole nationality of the people. They were going to be wiped off the face of the earth. So it's an important book, regardless of whether it gives a lot of references to God or spiritual matters. It records for us the salvation of the whole nation. So it's important just for that reason. Now, one other scroll that really didn't come into the public attention until 1967 is known as the Temple Scroll. Let me give you a little brief history, and you can write down what you think you need about the Temple Scroll. And the name Yigal Yadin, again, figures in here. He was one of the chiefs in Army intelligence for the Israeli government at this time, as well as a professional archaeologist, so he had a lot going in his life at this time. I believe in the month of August, don't have all this written down, but in August of 1960, Yadin received a letter. Of course, he lives in Jerusalem, or he lived. I think he just died. Received a letter from someone who claimed to be a Virginia clergyman. So it came from this country, stating that he had a Dead Sea Scroll that was unlike any of the other ones that had been discovered thus far. It wasn't, a forgery of the great Isaiah scroll or something. It was something new. It's something that had been found in the Dead Sea searching, but hadn't come to light yet. And he offered it to sell to Yigal Yadin for $1 million. Yadin turned him down, saying that he would reconsider the purchase of the manuscript if he would get the figure more in the ballpark of what the Israeli government had paid for the manuscripts from Metropolitan Samuel, which, remember, was $250,000, $250,000. Then a series of letters went across the Atlantic between Yadin and this professed Virginia clergyman. Very interesting story to show you the intrigue that goes on in the discovery of these ancient manuscripts. If I remember correctly, he lowered the price to $100,000. It's just one scroll, the temple scroll, $100,000, and Yadin said he would take it for $100,000. That's a lot of money for a scroll. And you have to, when you deal in this business, you have to be able to, take chances. He doesn't know this fella. Doesn't know him at all, but he says he's got a scroll, so you're not going to call him a liar. You're going to at least investigate it and see if you can get some things proven through your correspondence. So they settled on a price for $100,000, and then he didn't hear from him a while, and the next time he heard from him, the Virginia clergyman wanted $750,000 this time. So Yadin was very outraged over him raising the price sevenfold like that, so he said, no, the deal's off. So more letters back and forth, and finally they agreed on something like $130,000. I believe it was something in the area of $130,000 that he would pay for the manuscript. But before he would pay anything, he wanted proof of the manuscript, and so the Virginia clergyman tore a little of the manuscript off and sent it to him. Which wasn't that bad. He couldn't send him the whole thing. He couldn't send him a picture of it. He had to have the real thing in his hands. So he got the little thing in the mail, and in return, he was supposed to mail a $10,000 down payment to this unknown Virginia clergyman, which he did. Afterwards, the price went back up to, I think, $500,000 or $1 million, and cut off negotiations again and asked for his $10,000 back. And guess what? Never did get it and never heard from the man again. This all took place in 1960, and it probably went over into 1961. So he lost his $10,000. But he had that little corner of the manuscript, which means that if you ever came across anything like that again, you can always compare it. So as the mystery story goes on, on June 6th through June 11th, 1967, the date for the great Six-Day War in Israel, Yigal Yadin had taken leave of absence from his archaeological position at the university and was now serving as the chief for the army and intelligence for the Israeli government. And they took over part of Bethlehem. They took over part of the old city of Jerusalem that had belonged to the Arabs. And in all of the commotion that's going on, it's reported by a lieutenant in the Israeli army that they've come across an antiquities dealer that has some ancient manuscripts. And so right away, Yadin is alerted, because now not only is he an archaeologist, but he's actually serving officially in the army. And so by law, if they've come across this, they're able just to take it without questions or anything. It is taken by the Israeli government. They do pay for it in the future, but they want it now. They're not going to negotiate. They're going to take it, and then they'll negotiate afterwards once they've looked at it, which is the way to negotiate. They don't play games with this manuscript business. They say that belongs to us from our ancient forefathers, and we're not going to talk about it. We're going to take it, and then we'll be fair. They're a democratic country. We'll be fair. We'll pay for it afterwards. So it was held in the hands of Yigal Yadin for the first time on June 8th, which was the day if I remember correctly, that Old and New Jerusalem, the parts of Old and New Jerusalem were united. So it was a historic day in the history of Israel. And it was the first day that Yadin got his hands on this manuscript. They ended up paying $105,000. $75,000, if I remember correctly, was donated by a man from England, and that would leave the other $30,000 was paid by the Jewish government, by the Israeli government. And of course, what the whole interesting thing was, as soon as Yadin saw it, it was missing a corner to it. And it was an identical manuscript. Evidently, I mean, the pieces fit together perfectly that this Virginia clergyman had had. No one knows whether a Virginia clergyman ever had it or not. No one ever knows how it got back over to Jerusalem and to Bethlehem, and how were letters postmarked from some city in Virginia, and all of this that went on. What happened to the $10,000? Evidently, that dealer got paid $115,000 for it instead of $105,000 for it. But anyway, he got it. Here's a picture of it. This just came out this year. It's existed since '67. It's not been translated until I think just a few years ago. Not been made available to scholars, and just been made available to English reading and speaking students over the last few years. But I think the book that contains it cost a couple of $100 though. It was wrapped in a towel, and inside that was cellophane wrapper, and then here's what's known as the temple scroll inside, that he dates somewhere around the time of Christ, give or take 100 years. What's a temple scroll all about? Well, there's one very interesting absence of something in the Old Testament. You know, many times, here's some other pictures of it, many times in the law of Moses, references are made in the future tense to whenever you get to this certain city, and God never tells them it's Jerusalem. I'm going to establish that as my place, and you're going to build my place, and I'm going to put my name in that city. Speaking of the building of the temple. But you know what? Why, in all of the books of Moses, with all of the details that we have in the books of Moses, why are there no descriptions, no guidelines, no regulations for the building of the temple? It's been one of the things that Old Testament scholars have wrestled with for years. When you had all of that detail given for a little temporary Mosaic tabernacle. You remember whole books written just on that. The great temple, nothing given for it at all. Why? Well, no one's been able to figure out why. Another problem related to the kingship in Israel. It's mentioned a couple of times, the most important time in Deuteronomy 17. Just a handful of verses given concerning the monarchy in Israel. Why not elaborate details given like for the priest in the law of Moses? Well, the claim of some has been that those details were given, but they've now been lost. What does the temple scroll contain? Elaborate details for the building of Solomon's temple. Or that's what it alleges itself to be. Elaborate details for the building of Solomon's temple that was written by Moses, that was given to Joshua, that was handed to the elders that outlived Joshua, that was handed down through the prophet Samuel, eventually made its way all the way to King David, and then David was the one who gave it to Solomon. If you'll turn over to I'll find it, First Chronicles. First Chronicles 28, verses 11 and 12. A lot of the discussion involves these two verses. It gives a lot of detail about the building of the temple. And this is supposed to be part of the lost Torah of Moses. Then David gave to Solomon his son the pattern of the porch, and of the houses thereof, and of the treasuries thereof, and of the upper chambers thereof, and of the inner parlors thereof, and of the place of the mercy seat. Here are some descriptions, but yet we're not told what they are. We're just told David gave them to Solomon. Where did David get them? The pattern of all that he had by the Spirit of the courts of the house of the Lord, and of the chambers round about, and of the treasuries of the house of God, and of the treasuries of the dedicated things. Notice the marginal reading. And the pattern of all that was with him. With him where? Well, it was with him in a written form that had been handed down from the time of Moses. What can we say about it? Not a lot, because it's a pretty difficult question. We would probably be best to venture the idea that it's one of those post-biblical works of the Qumran community, because something as important as Solomon's temple, if there were descriptions given by God, would no doubt be extant somewhere in the Old Testament. I mean, talking about back in the time of Moses. If it was going to be given by someone, Moses is a great revealer of truth to the people, even in their future years. You can read Deuteronomy 28 and see what all he sees for them in the future, whenever they turn away from God. So he certainly had the ability to receive from the Lord. He got all that back there in Genesis 1 when he wasn't living there. Why couldn't he get all in the future about Solomon's temple and what would the laws that would govern the monarchy? But in reading some of the material, of course, what people want to try to do is compare the material that's given in this temple scroll, and it's not been available but for the last few years, with what Solomon's temple actually looked like according to what you can understand from a description of it in the Old Testament, and see do they go together. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So it appears that we'll probably have to put this, until something else comes up, and if anything changes, I'll let you know, we'll probably put it as something that's not biblical. It wasn't written by Moses. Of course, this wouldn't be the original copy by Moses. This would be a copy of a copy that came down over a process of many years. But until we find out something more, I guess we'll just leave it at that. That evidently it was not written by Moses. It was one of those works done by the scribes, the writers of books there in the Essene Qumran community. Now, someone asked earlier where are these things found, and I said I think that they're found either in the museum in Jordan or the museum in Israel, one of the others, where most of these manuscripts are now found because they've been attained by the two countries. Now, where does this tie in? We're talking about textual criticism, the text of the Old Testament. Where does this tie in to that? Well, the most important question that we have to raise in all of this is how does the Masoretic text compare with the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because all Hebrew Bibles everywhere today are dependent directly upon the Masoretic text. That's why we spend a lot of time discussing the standardization of the text. Before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest Hebrew manuscripts that we have, and remember all of them are Masoretic, we don't have any that are non-Masoretic except the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest ones date back to around the 10th century. Remember we gave you the date for the earliest dated incomplete manuscript of around 895 AD. The earliest dated complete manuscript of the Old Testament was around the year 1008. So 895, that's around the beginning of the 10th century AD. That's the earliest manuscript that we have. So what did the Dead Sea Scrolls do? They push us back 1,000 years in history, and more important than that, they push us back before the process of standardization began with the Masoretes. So we know that this isn't going to be a Masoretic text. The Masoretes didn't exist in 200 BC, whenever 2QSAMB was written, that Samuel manuscript, the oldest one, or 1QISA, the great Isaiah scroll. Masoretes didn't exist then. So the greatest thing in all of this is let's take our Hebrew Bibles now, let's take Isaiah now and compare it to Dead Sea Scroll copy of Isaiah and see where the Masoretes write on after all. Let me give you a few statistics concerning the book of Isaiah, since that's the most important one. They not only move us back 1,000 years, but they move us back to pre-Masoretic days. And the surprising and the blessed thing that we can say is they're virtually identical. The Masoretic text that dates 895 AD is very, very similar to the greater and to the lesser Isaiah scroll. There are not great differences, which is a remarkable testimony to the accuracy and to the laboriousness and the studiousness of the Masoretic scribes. because a lot of things could have changed in 1,000 years unless they were very particular about which manuscripts they used and which variants they kept. There are only about 13 places in the book of Isaiah as it exists today, based on Masoretic text. There are only about 13 places where something that is, I hate to call it substantial because I don't mean a great doctrinal truth, but more than just a letter change, where something substantial needs to be changed. That's in 66 books, and you know how long the book of Isaiah is. Only about 13 places. I'll just show you one of these. Some of the other ones, it's questionable whether they even need to be changed. I'm saying that a lot of scholars say about 13. I would say less than 13 myself, because I don't agree with some of the changes. But here's one that I certainly agree with, Isaiah chapter 21 and verse 8. Something that had gone down through Masoretic manuscripts that didn't make a whole lot of sense at all. When it's translated into English, it makes even less sense. And you go back to the Isaiah scrolls, either the greater or the lesser one, and they give a different reading here, which makes more sense. So obviously we're going to change it. Isaiah 21. This is the burden of the vision of the desert and the sea. And verse 8. Now look, just read the verse, and what in the world does that mean? And he cried, a lion. My Lord, I stand continually upon the watchtower in the daytime, and I am set in my ward whole nights. That doesn't make any sense that he cried a lion. What it says in the Dead Sea Scroll manuscript is, and he who saw cried, my Lord, and that's where the capital should start, not a capital, a lion, and then another capital, my Lord. So it should be, and he who saw cried. Just a confusion of words here. Words that shouldn't have been in here. You see in the margin, they even try to give us a marginal reading. And he cried as a lion, because they know that doesn't make sense for it just to blurt out, and he cried a lion, and then he cries again, my Lord. Why is he changing subjects here? So it should read, and he who saw cried. Another statistic that's generally given concerning Isaiah 53, since that's probably the greatest chapter in the book of Isaiah, is the following. Of the 166 Hebrew words in Isaiah 53, according to the Masoretic text, only 17 Hebrew letters differ in 1QISA. Of 166 words, there are only, none of the words differ. There are 17 differences in letters, which really don't change the meaning. Or don't change the meaning, not really don't, they don't at all. Only 17 Hebrew letters that are different when we compare the Masoretic text with the great Isaiah scroll. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is their most important contribution, not just to sit around and study, but how reliable is our Old Testament? Since the earliest copies of our Old Testament are 10th century A.D. And the New Testament goes way back earlier than that. And yet the Old was written way earlier than the New. So that's been a problem for critical scholars for years and years. The Old Testament's not reliable because the earliest copies we have are the earliest dated incomplete copies, 895 A.D. But you see, now we're moving it back 1,000 years, and we're really not changing anything. So who's to say 1,000 years before that, we still aren't going to change anything if we've already moved 1,000 years? Which means from the great Isaiah scroll back to the time of Moses, not a lot's going to change. It's going to stay essentially the same, which is what we've been showing in textual criticism. There are minor letters and words and little things to be changed, but not whole chapters and whole books and things like that that are to be taken out. People don't believe in Esther, they don't believe in Isaiah, they believe in 2 Isaiahs or 3 or half a dozen because they say, well, nothing's reliable being as recent as those times are, but now you can't use that excuse anymore. Now you're going to have to use the excuse you should be using anyway. It's your old unbelief. That's your excuse. You don't want to believe the Word of God. It's not because you can't find a manuscript with your pet date on it. Because we go back 1,000 years and they still have problems. Yeah, but what about those manuscripts? Maybe those aren't reliable. What about what Moses really wrote? Of course, Moses never did live. And if he did live, it was probably the first century before Christ or something. So they're all mixed up. Who wants to follow someone who can't even follow themselves? They're so mixed up. So the greatest contribution is the fact that they move us back 1,000 years to pre-Masoretic times and still substantiate the Masoretic text. Which is why we took the time we did on the Masoretes to show you how particular they were. Now we've got proof of it, how particular they were. That over the process of 1,000 years, they didn't change anything except small variations that are excusable when you're talking about hundreds of different men over a 1,000-year period. So the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't just something to be swept under the rug or something done in a corner. They're very important. They don't help us out as far as believing the Bible, but they sure show us a thing or two about the critics and where they are and who you don't want to follow. Whether it convinces the critics of anything, it sure makes them look like a fool when they've been complaining about all these things for so long, and now what can you complain about? Except God did it in some way that you'd rather have it done in another way. You want things done your way instead of God's way. Okay, that's the Dead Sea Scrolls. It ought to give you a good summary of them so you can have a working understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you won't think of them as just 14 manuscripts that someone found in a cave one day. There's a lot more than just that. A lot more than just that. And those aren't all the ancient manuscripts. Next week we'll start getting into some more ancient Hebrew manuscripts. Just that the Dead Sea Scrolls are the most complete ones and the most remarkable ones.